Daniel Whitmore was a billionaire who thought he had seen everything. But one quiet night, hiding behind a barely open door, he watched his new Maid do something in his study that made absolutely no sense. And instead of confronting her, he kept watching. What he uncovered over the weeks that followed would shake his company, expose a betrayal he never saw coming, and force him to question everything he thought he knew about the people right in front of him. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The Whitmore estate sat at the end of a long private driveway lined with oak trees, so old their roots had cracked the stone path in places no gardener had gotten around to fixing. From the road, you could barely see the house, just the top floors, pale stone and tall windows, rising above the tree-line like something out of another century. Inside, it was the kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful. It felt abandoned. Daniel Whitmore pulled his car into the garage at 11:47 on a Tuesday night and sat there for a long moment after cutting the engine, his hands still resting on the wheel. The board meeting had gone 3 hours over schedule. 46 minutes of that had been people talking in circles about a quarterly projection he had read and fully understood in the first 8 minutes. He was tired in a way that sleep no longer fixed, a bone-deep, creeping exhaustion that had less to do with the hours and everything to do with the weight of keeping something this large from quietly falling apart without him noticing until it was too late. He was 44 years old, and Whitmore Systems was his life's work. He had built it from a 2-room office with second-hand servers and a team of 4 people who believed in him before he had given them any real reason to. Now the company employed over 3,000 people, had active contracts with federal agencies, and had been featured on the cover of 2 major business publications in the last year alone. None of that felt particularly real to Daniel anymore. What felt real was the ticking of the cooling engine, the empty garage, and the nagging sense that something somewhere was quietly going wrong, and he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. He gathered his briefcase and walked through the side entrance into the house. The kitchen was clean, the lights on their timers still glowing softly in the darkness. Mrs. Aldridge, his head housekeeper for the past 11 years, had left a covered plate in the refrigerator with a handwritten note taped to the plastic wrap. Chicken and rice. Eat something. He stood there in the refrigerator's cold light and read it twice. The way a person reads something when they know the intention behind it and feel it more than they want to. He replaced the foil, let the refrigerator door swing shut, and walked past without touching the plate. He would eat tomorrow. He was never hungry at this hour anymore. The financial leak rumors had been circling for nearly 3 weeks. Nothing confirmed, nothing he could point to directly, just a pattern in the numbers that didn't sit right when he turned it over in his mind late at night, and a feeling in his gut that he had learned, over 20 years of building things and occasionally watching them break, to take very seriously. The company's quarterly earnings should have been stronger. The explanations his CFO Victor Langford had offered were reasonable on the surface, articulate, well-organized, nothing obviously wrong, but they had a particular quality of being just slightly too smooth. Like someone who had rehearsed their lines one too many times and had started to lose the pauses that made speech sound like thought. Daniel walked down the hall toward his study, loosening his tie as he went, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The room was spotless. That stopped him. Not because it was unusual for it to be clean. Mrs. Aldridge ran a tight house and expected her staff to maintain it, but because the specific arrangement of things on his desk was subtly different from how he had left it that morning. Not dramatically, just slightly. The pen cup had moved an inch to the left. The folder he had left lying open was now closed and squared neatly with the edge of the desk surface. The leather chair was pushed in further than he ever pushed it when he stood up. He stood in the doorway and studied the room for a moment. Then he walked to the desk, pulled out the chair, sat down, opened his laptop, and told himself he was being paranoid. He had enough real problems without inventing new ones. But the feeling stayed with him. Her name was Naomi Carter, and she had started 3 weeks ago on a Monday. The domestic agency that supplied the Whitmore household's cleaning staff had sent over her paperwork without much ceremony. Background check came back clean, 2 solid references from previous private households, a certification in household management from an accredited program, no complaints on record from either employer. Mrs. Aldridge had interviewed her herself over the course of 40 minutes and had reported back to Daniel in a single sentence: efficient and unobtrusive. In Mrs. Aldridge's particular vocabulary, that was about as high a compliment as you were going to receive. Naomi was 28 years old. She was quiet in the way that some people become quiet after life has pressed on them long enough. Not meek, not shy, but conserving. Silence cost less than words, and she was a woman who had learned to manage every cost carefully. She arrived on time every day, which at the Whitmore house meant 5 minutes early. She kept her uniform pressed, wore her hair pinned back without making a fuss about it, and did her assigned work without ever needing to be told a second time. The other household staff had warmed to her over the weeks the way co-workers warm to someone they genuinely respect but don't yet fully know, politely, with a small, comfortable distance. What the other staff had noticed, and what Mrs. Aldridge had mentioned once in passing to no one in particular, was that Naomi worked longer than anyone else on the evening crew. She didn't make a production of it. She didn't stay visible or linger in common areas where someone might notice and comment on her dedication. She just kept finding things to do after everyone else had wrapped up: a sill that needed wiping, a rug edge that had started to curl, a stretch of baseboard that the morning crew had skipped. The overtime she declined without comment when Mrs. Aldridge offered it. What no one had thought to track was that in the 3 weeks since she had started, Naomi had volunteered for the late evening cleaning of the East Wing on 4 separate occasions. The East Wing contained the library, 2 guest suites that went unused most of the year, a formal sitting room nobody sat in, and Daniel Whitmore's private study. The first time Daniel paid real attention to it was on a Wednesday. He had been working late in the study, which was almost every night, when he heard the quiet sound of movement in the corridor outside, the faint smell of cleaning spray drifting under the door. He opened the study door and looked out. Naomi was at the far end of the hall, crouched at the baseboard below the library entrance, spraying and wiping with methodical, unhurried strokes. She didn't look up when the study door opened. She kept working. He stood there for a few seconds, watching her, then went back inside and closed the door. He turned it over in his mind for the rest of the evening without arriving anywhere useful. On Thursday, he made a decision. He told Mrs. Aldridge at 9:30 that he was heading upstairs early. An early morning tomorrow, he said, he'd finish his reading up there. He said goodnight, walked toward the staircase, and then turned around as soon as he was out of sight and came back through the dining room, cut through the butler's pantry, and worked his way to the storage room that connected to the east corridor through a door that never fully latched. When left an inch open, that door offered a direct line of sight to the study entrance. He stood in the dark at 10:15, still in his work clothes, jacket still on, and waited. At 10:22, the study door opened from inside the hallway. Naomi walked in. She didn't reach for the overhead light switch. She crossed to the corner of the desk and clicked on the small amber lamp. The one he barely ever used, the one with the warm, low glow that didn't reach the window or bleed into the hall beneath the door. She stood still for a full 10 seconds after that, just listening, her head slightly tilted, making sure she was alone. That detail was deliberate. Daniel felt it immediately. She had made that specific choice deliberately. She put her cleaning caddy on the floor beside the door and didn't reach for it. Instead, she reached into the large front pocket of her apron and began pulling out money. Not stealing. She was pulling out her own. It came in careful stacks, folded bills organized by denomination, bound with rubber bands and small paper clips, the kind of careful bundling that comes from handling the same stacks repeatedly until the habit becomes automatic. She carried it to the desk and began laying it out in front of her. Her hands moved with a quiet speed, peeling off bills and counting on her breath, lips barely moving, eyes tracking the growing total with total focus. She had a small notebook, spiral-bound, drugstore quality, the cover worn soft at the corners, and she opened it to a page already dense with handwritten figures in small, even columns. She began writing, paused to recount when she reached a new number, confirmed it twice before committing it to paper. Daniel stood perfectly still in the dark doorway and tried to make sense of what he was watching. His first instinct, the one that rose up before he could stop it, and the one he would feel quietly ashamed of for a long time afterward, was that she was stealing, that the cash had come from somewhere inside the house. He moved through it quickly in his mind. The petty cash account, the household expense envelope Mrs. Aldridge kept in her office, the small locked drawer in this very study where he kept an emergency cash reserve. For about 30 seconds, he was almost certain. She was a thief. His instincts had been right. Then she did something that didn't fit that theory at all. She reached back in her apron and pulled out a second, smaller bundle of cash. This one looser, more worn, the bills soft and curved the way money gets when it's been folded and unfolded and carried close to the body for weeks. She counted it with the same quiet precision, then added it to the growing total on the desk. Her own money joining whatever was already there, going in the same direction. She wasn't taking. She was adding. Daniel watched her seal the combined amount into an envelope she had brought in the apron's inner pocket. She wrote along the front of it carefully, dates from what he could see, though the angle made the specific numbers hard to read. She tucked it back into the apron. She closed the notebook. She placed the pen in her breast pocket with a gesture that was almost reflexive, the practiced motion of someone who is always keeping track and never loses their pen. Then she stood there, alone, in the amber light, one hand resting on top of the closed notebook. The house was silent. The clock on the mantel made its soft sound. Outside, the oak trees moved a little in the wind. She whispered something, so quiet it was almost nothing, the kind of thing you say when you believe you're completely alone, when there's no audience and no performance, and it's just you and the weight of whatever it is you're carrying. Just a little more, she said. Then Eli will be safe. Daniel did not move. He stood in the dark doorway and listened to the silence that followed those words, and he felt something shift in his understanding of the situation, some fundamental reorientation, like a ship turning in a current, slow and definitive. He watched her give the desk a slow, thorough wipe down, unnecessary, habit-driven, the action of a person who finishes what she starts. She turned off the amber lamp. She picked up the cleaning caddy and walked out. He stayed in the dark for a while after her footsteps faded down the hall. Then he walked to his desk, sat down in the chair she had been sitting in moments before, and looked at the clean, empty surface in front of him. Something about this situation was much more complicated than it had first appeared. And whoever Eli was, whoever needed to be kept safe and what that was going to cost, all of that mattered in a way he hadn't yet figured out how to name. The next morning, Daniel was at his desk by 6, well before the rest of the household stirred. He pulled out the secure personal laptop from the locked bottom drawer, the one he kept off the company network, and went through every account, every household ledger, every petty cash log he had access to with the same careful focus he brought to an earnings review. He cross-referenced the emergency cash drawer against Mrs. Aldridge's expense records. He checked the household account statements going back 6 weeks. Everything balanced. Nothing was missing. Not a single dollar was unaccounted for anywhere. He sat back and looked at the ceiling for a while. He had stood in the dark and watched a woman count and carefully save her own money, in private, in a room she believed was empty, whispering the name of someone who needed to be safe. And his first reaction had been to assume she was stealing from him. He sat with that for an uncomfortable moment, then moved on, because there was still something here that didn't add up, the level of precision in that notebook, the structure of the calculations, the dated envelopes. None of it matched the profile of someone simply setting money aside. That evening, he waited by the upstairs window that overlooked the rear of the property. At 7:12, Naomi came out through the staff exit in her regular clothes, dark jeans, a gray jacket, a worn canvas backpack, and walked down to the service road where the eastbound bus stopped. Daniel pulled on his jacket, went downstairs, and got into his car. He followed the bus route at a distance through the commercial streets and out into the part of the city where the buildings were a different kind of quiet, worn in rather than elegant, functional rather than comfortable. Naomi rode the bus for 41 minutes. She got off 3 blocks from a regional hospital that specialized in long-term neurological care cases. Not the large one in the medical district. This was a smaller facility, older, the kind of place that had been quietly doing its work for decades without much fanfare or recognition. He parked down the street and watched her walk through the main entrance. He waited 15 minutes, giving himself time to feel bad about what he was doing and then do it anyway. Then he followed her in. A brief, vague conversation at the reception desk. He was looking for a visiting family member, young woman, late 20s, pointed him toward the 4th floor. He found a waiting area near the elevator bank that gave him a clear sight line down the main corridor of the neurological ward without making him obvious. And he sat down in a plastic chair between a man reading a paperback novel and an older woman asleep under a thin hospital blanket. And he waited. The ward smelled like antiseptic and the particular stillness of a place where people came to try to fix things that were very hard to fix. The lights were lower in the evening, some kind of accommodation the staff made for the patients down the hall, and the whole floor had a muted, careful quality to it that made Daniel feel, despite himself, like he was somewhere he shouldn't be. About 20 minutes later, a doctor came out of a room at the far end of the hall and walked with Naomi into the small family consultation area across from the nurse's station. Daniel couldn't catch the full conversation, but the hospital had that quality of late-night quiet that carried voices further than anyone expected. He heard the words, experimental protocol. He heard treatment window, and then a pause. He heard a number followed by the phrase before the end of the month. And even from across the corridor, he could hear the specific gravity that number carried. Not a figure for a regular treatment, but the kind that represented a threshold between what was possible and what wasn't. Naomi's voice, when she responded, was carefully level. She asked 2 questions, precise and practical, no wavering in them. She nodded twice. The doctor put his hand briefly on her shoulder, the gesture of someone who has done everything within their medical power and is now handing the rest of a situation to someone else, and walked back down the corridor. Naomi stood alone in the consultation alcove. She pressed one hand flat against the wall, head lowered, and was still for a moment. Then she straightened, pulled her jacket back into place, and walked to the room at the end of the hall. Through the narrow window in the door, Daniel could make out a teenage boy in the bed, thin, propped on several pillows, appearing to be asleep. Naomi sat down in the chair beside him. She reached over and rested her hand gently on top of his. Daniel stepped back from the sight line and took the elevator back to the ground floor. He sat in his car in the hospital parking lot with the engine off. The night was cold. He didn't start the car for a long time. He was thinking about the money in the envelope and the calculations in the notebook and the whispered certainty in her voice when she said just a little more. He was thinking about a woman riding an hour's worth of buses to sit with a sick boy in a hospital room, and then riding them back to clean floors in a house large enough to contain the whole ward. He started the car and drove home without the radio on. The next day, Victor Langford came into Daniel's office at Whitmore Systems headquarters carrying a stack of printed reports and the settled confidence of a man who had been CFO long enough to believe his interpretations of the numbers were more reliable than anyone else's, including the person who owned the company. Victor was 51 years old, polished, silver-haired, and composed in the particular way of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the stakes were high and had learned to perform calm as a professional tool. He had been with the company for 9 years, had been there when it was still growing into itself, and wore that history the way some people were seniority, as though it explained and justified everything. The quarterly picture wasn't good, Victor said. Market fluctuations, sector sofnis, competitive pressure in 3 of their primary contract areas. He laid it out clearly and walked Daniel through each figure with practiced patience, answering every question Daniel raised, never losing the thread. It was, as always, a smooth and well-organized presentation, the kind that left you feeling informed and slightly unsettled at the same time, without being able to point to a specific reason why. Daniel asked twice about a specific cluster of outgoing transactions in the infrastructure services division, figures that didn't match any vendor contract or disbursement schedule he could find documentation for. Victor had an explanation ready: third-party vendor adjustments, standard reconciliation delays, nothing unusual for a company operating at their scale. Daniel nodded and let it pass. But he kept the page. After Victor left, Daniel made a call from his personal phone to Marcus Hale. Marcus Hale was a former financial crimes detective who had spent 22 years on the force before leaving 4 years ago to work independently. He was not flashy, not particularly easy to talk to, and not cheap. He was also thorough in a way that was difficult to find patient in a way that was harder still, and had a network of contacts in financial institutions, regulatory bodies, and accounting firms that he had built quietly over 2 decades and never wasted. Daniel had used him twice before. Once for a vendor fraud matter that had been eating at company margins for 18 months, and once for a background investigation on a potential board member who had turned out to have a quietly interesting history with offshore accounts. Both times Hale had delivered. Daniel gave him the transaction figures that had been bothering him and told him to move quietly. Hale called back 5 days later. He had found something, not the full picture yet, but a pattern. Transfers moving through the company's vendor payment channels in amounts small enough to avoid automated alerts, but consistent and rhythmic, appearing at regular intervals. The money was flowing outward and surfacing somewhere else through a layered routing system. He had traced 3 of the transfers to the next step. There were almost certainly more going back further. He would keep following it. Daniel thanked him, hung up, and remained in his office chair without moving for several minutes. That night, well after midnight, he did something unplanned. He went to the East Wing utility closet with a master key and retrieved Naomi's notebook from the cleaning caddy where he had seen her store it. He carried it to the study, set it under the amber lamp, and opened it carefully. The first several pages were exactly what he had expected: a savings register. Columns of weekly deposits, running totals, a countdown of sorts toward a specific dollar amount written at the top of the page in slightly heavier ink, circled twice. Medical payment deadlines noted in the margins with small calendar references. The arithmetic was modest but precise, the discipline of someone managing something very close to impossible with no margin for mistakes and no one else to catch an error. He turned further into the notebook. The middle section was different in character entirely. It began with what appeared to be partial figures she had copied, numbers he recognized from documents that had been sitting on his desk in recent weeks. Not full reports, not systematic copying, fragments. The kind of thing a person might notice in passing while wiping down a surface, if that person happened to be paying attention in a particular way. But what she had done with those fragments was what stopped him completely. She had run calculations. Long, multi-step cross-reference calculations written in a hand that was small and unhurried and entirely confident. She had matched vendor codes across entries separated by weeks. She had flagged a recurring transaction identifier that appeared in several of the outflows. She had drawn connecting lines in pencil between figures that only related to each other if you knew what you were looking for and had taken the time to map it carefully. At the bottom of one page, in her neat small handwriting, she had written a note next to a circled number. This doesn't match the disbursement schedule. Where does this go? On the next page, she had started trying to answer that question, and she had gotten 3 steps further into the transaction chain than Marcus Hale had managed in 5 days of professional investigation. Daniel sat with the notebook open in both hands and stayed very still. He had spent 2 decades of his career evaluating people, hiring talent, developing it, losing it occasionally to companies that paid more, recognizing it sometimes in unexpected places. He knew what he was looking at right now. This wasn't idle curiosity or coincidence or the lucky guess of someone flipping through papers. This was a trained analytical mind that had noticed something wrong in a set of numbers, recognized the shape of the irregularity, and begun pulling the thread the only way it knew how, carefully, systematically, without drama, and without anyone's permission. He turned back to the front of the notebook and read through the savings totals again. The medical payment schedule, the running count toward the end of the month. He closed the notebook. He returned it to the utility closet exactly as he had found it, relocked the door, and walked back through the dark hallways of the house to the study. He stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the black lawn, the oak trees barely visible against the sky. The house was completely silent around him. Somewhere on the upper floor, his household staff slept, including a woman with a spiral notebook and a sick brother and the kind of mind that didn't fit anywhere near the role she was currently filling. There was something wrong inside his company. Someone on the inside was bleeding it carefully, in a way designed not to be found until the damage was too large to hide. His investigator was working the problem, but in a cleaning caddy in a utility closet on the east wing, tucked beneath spray bottles and folded rags, There was a notebook that was already ahead of the investigation. Daniel didn't fully know yet what to do with any of this. The problem had layers he hadn't anticipated when he first started paying attention to a maid who worked late. What had started as a suspicion about missing money had turned into something involving a sick boy, a hidden talent, and a fraud scheme that was apparently being independently investigated by someone who cleaned his study for a living. But standing in the quiet of the study where everything had started, where he had first watched her count her money by the amber lamp and heard her say the name of the person she was fighting to save, he understood one thing clearly. Naomi Carter was not what she appeared to be, and whatever was coming next was going to be a great deal more complicated than he had bargained for. The confrontation came on a Thursday morning. It did not go the way Daniel had expected. He had spent 2 days turning it over. How to approach her, what to say, how much to reveal about what he had seen and what he had read. He had considered calling Mrs. Aldridge in first, making it a formal matter, going through the proper channels of the household. He had considered saying nothing at all and simply watching longer. In the end, he did neither. He waited until the rest of the morning staff had moved to the West Wing, walked to where Naomi was straightening the library shelves, and said her name. She turned around without startling. That was the first thing he noticed. Most people, when their employer suddenly appears and says their name in a quiet room, show some small physical reaction, a flinch, a catch in the breath, a momentary widening of the eyes. Naomi simply turned and looked at him with the calm, attentive expression of someone who had been expecting this and had already decided how she would handle it. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. He told her to follow him to the study. She did, setting the books she was holding down on the shelf with careful hands before she came. He closed the study door behind them. He had placed her notebook on the desk that morning, open to the page with the circled transaction figure and her handwritten note. "This doesn't match the disbursement schedule. Where does this go?" He watched her eyes go to it when she entered the room. He watched her register what it meant that it was there. Something passed through her expression. Not panic, not guilt. Something closer to the careful adjustment of a person recalculating a situation they had already thought through several possible versions of. "I owe you an explanation," she said before he could say anything. "You owe me several," he said. "Start wherever you want." She did not sit down. She stood near the desk with her hands clasped in front of her and explained in plain, unhurried language that she had studied accounting and financial analytics at Carver University before dropping out in her second year. Her parents had both died within 4 months of each other. Her father first, her mother 8 weeks later, a grief that had operated on her mother like a slow system failure. Naomi had been 22. Eli had been 11. There had been no one else. She had taken care of him. She had worked. She had eventually landed the domestic agency work because it paid reliably. The hours were flexible enough to manage a child's schedule around, and it required no degree, no credential, no interview that asked where she had seen herself in 5 years. She had been doing it for 6 years. The work was honest, and she did it well, and she had no complaints about it. When Eli's illness had been diagnosed 18 months ago, the financial reality had changed entirely. "The notebook," Daniel said. She looked at it again. "I noticed numbers when I was cleaning. I wasn't going through your things. I want you to understand that. But you worked in here with papers open, and I have a particular kind of memory for figures. Once I see a number in context, I tend to keep it." She paused. "I started writing things down because what I was seeing didn't look right. It was a habit. It wasn't meant to be anything more than that." "It's more than that," Daniel said. He sat down in his chair and gestured toward the notebook. "Walk me through what you found." She hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she sat down across from him and began to talk. He had been prepared to ask questions. He had not been prepared for the answers. He started by testing her because he was a thorough man and he needed to be sure of what he was dealing with before he did anything else with it. He asked her about amortization schedules and what they revealed when a company was managing long-term debt against variable revenue. He asked her about the difference between operating cash flow and free cash flow and why the distinction mattered critically when a company was attempting to conceal a loss within its reporting structure. He asked her about shell company construction and how multi-jurisdiction layering functioned in transaction routing designed to obscure the final destination of funds. He asked her, almost as a final measure, to walk him through the full reconciliation process for a multi-division corporation managing vendor payments across subsidiaries with different fiscal calendars. She answered every question, not with the careful, reaching quality of someone pulling at half-remembered knowledge from years ago, with the direct, specific, fully inhabited fluency of someone for whom this had been a living language and had never entirely stopped being one, even when life had forced it underground. By the time she was done with the last answer, Daniel had set down his pen. "You mentioned noticing unusual numbers in here," he said. "Show me specifically what you saw." She picked up the notebook, found the right page without having to look, and laid it on the desk between them. Then she began to explain. She kept going. She had cross-referenced the transaction dates against the company's standard billing cycles. Information she had pieced together from partial documents she had seen in the study over the course of several weeks, building the background picture the way you build any picture when you work slowly and pay close attention and have nowhere else to be. The payments falling outside the normal billing cycle windows were the ones worth watching. There were 11 of them she had identified so far. The amounts were varied enough to look random if you only looked at them individually. But the intervals between them were not random at all. They were consistent, rhythmic, adjusted at regular intervals in a way that suggested someone monitoring the detection thresholds and staying deliberately beneath them. "Someone is doing this deliberately," she said. It wasn't a question. There was no uncertainty in it all. "Yes," Daniel said. "Someone with access to the payment authorization system and enough institutional authority that the transactions get processed without triggering a secondary review. That means someone at a senior level. Not a clerk, not a mid-level manager. Someone whose approvals move without question." "Yes." She looked at him steadily across the desk, her hands resting still in her lap. "That's not an external actor. That's someone inside the company who has been there long enough to understand exactly where the gaps in the monitoring are." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the gardener's sounds had stopped, and the house had settled back into its late morning stillness. He looked at the notebook spread between them, the work she had done alone, in the margins of shifts from partial glimpses of documents she had not been meant to see. "The total you've calculated," he said, "the amount you think has moved out of the company." She turned to the last page with figures on it and showed him. The number she had arrived at was close. Not exact because she was still working from incomplete information, but within a margin that made Daniel's jaw tighten before he could stop it. It was significantly larger than what Hale had managed to confirm so far. "Whoever is doing this," she said quietly, closing the notebook, "has been very careful for a very long time." Daniel called Hale that afternoon from the private line and gave him Naomi's transaction codes without explaining where they had come from. Hale was quiet for a long time on the other end of the phone. "Where did you get these?" he asked finally. "Does it matter?" Another pause. "It matters because whoever found these is either very good or got very lucky, and I'd like to know which." "Very good," Daniel said. "What did they tell you?" Hale told him to give him 24 hours. He called back in 18. The vendor code Naomi had flagged was, as she had suspected, being used to route payments through a layered network of accounts. Accounts that Hale had been trying to trace from the other direction, starting from the company's outflows and working forward. With the code, he could now work backward from the receiving end. The two directions were converging on the same point. The point was an offshore holding structure. Several layers of subsidiaries, each one incorporated in a different jurisdiction, each one appearing legitimate on its own. It was sophisticated work, the kind that took time and planning and the cooperation of at least one person inside the company with deep system access and the authority to move money without triggering standard review. Meanwhile, the situation at Whitmore Systems was shifting in ways that Daniel could feel but couldn't fully see yet. Victor had been unusually active in the past week. More board communications than was standard, more private lunches with individual members, more carefully worded updates about the company's financial position. The narrative was being shaped. Daniel could tell that much. The details of what the narrative was being shaped toward were still just out of reach. During a board conference call on a Wednesday afternoon, Victor mentioned twice that the company's recent performance challenges might benefit from a fresh strategic perspective at the leadership level. He said it both times with the smooth casualness of someone making an obvious point, not a pointed one. 3 board members had said nothing in response, but their silence had a particular quality to it. Daniel had noticed. He said nothing. On a quiet evening in the mansion, Daniel found Naomi in the study later than usual. She had started coming in during her regular shift now, not the late volunteer hours. He had asked her to, in a careful way that he hoped didn't sound like an order. He had given her access to a subset of the transaction records he kept on a secure drive, enough to continue the analysis she had already started. She hadn't asked for an explanation or for details about what he suspected or who he suspected. She had simply started working. He was at the side table reviewing Hale's latest notes when she said, without looking up from the figures spread in front of her, "I think I've found the control account." He put down the papers. She had been working through the subsidiary structure that Hale's investigation had partially mapped, approaching it from the payment pattern side rather than the corporate registration side. Where Hale had been looking for the company names and jurisdictions, Naomi had been looking for the mathematical signature, the specific way the amounts were sized and timed that would tell her which account was orchestrating the others rather than simply receiving from them. She turned the notebook. He called Hale the next morning and gave him the control account identifier. He told him where he needed to look next. Hale spent 3 days on it and came back with confirmation that went several layers deeper than what Naomi had been able to reach with the partial records she was working from. The control account was real. The connection to Victor's name was real. Not direct, not the kind of thing that would hold up in court on its own, but clear enough to establish the direction. The network of shell companies had been constructed over a period of roughly 2 years, beginning a few months before the first irregular transaction had appeared in the company's payment records. Victor had been building this before he started using it. He had been patient about it. The confirmed total of what had moved through the network so far was somewhere in the range of $40 million. Hale said that number was likely a floor, not a ceiling. The transfers that were hardest to trace, the early ones, before the pattern had fully established itself, were still being reconstructed. Daniel sat with that number in the silence of his study and felt a specific kind of anger that he recognized from the 2 or 3 times in his career when someone he had trusted had shown him what they had actually been doing with that trust. It was cold and clarifying, not hot. It made him think more precisely, not less. He told Hale to keep going. Then he asked Naomi if she was willing to continue. She said yes without hesitating. They worked mostly at night, after the household had gone to bed. Daniel would pull up the financial records on the secure drive. Naomi would work through them with her notebook and a mechanical pencil she had started keeping in her apron pocket specifically for this purpose, and they would go over what Hale had found against what she could see in the transaction patterns, building the picture from both directions at once. It was a strange arrangement by any reasonable measure. A billionaire tech magnate and his maid sitting across from each other at 11 o'clock at night, working a corporate fraud investigation under the amber lamp in the same study where all of this had started. But it worked with a consistency that surprised Daniel a little. Her mind moved differently than Hale's. Hale followed chains, one link at a time, methodically and reliably forward. Naomi found shapes. She looked at a page of numbers the way someone looks at a room when they walk in for the first time, taking the whole thing before she focused on any one piece of it, noticing what was out of proportion before she started measuring anything specific. Between the 2 of them, and Hale working in parallel from his end, they were covering ground that none of them was covering alone. She was good at it in a way that was both specific and recognizable to Daniel, who had spent 2 decades evaluating people in professional settings. Not just the technical foundation, the accounting principles, the system's logic, the pattern recognition she had clearly been developing long before she ever walked through his front door. It was also her patience. She didn't force conclusions when the data wasn't ready to give them. She backed up when she hit a wall, looked at what was around the wall, and found the edge that gave her a different angle in. She treated the problem as a thing to be mapped fully before it could be solved cleanly, and the map was always the thing that eventually led somewhere real. Daniel found himself watching her work on certain evenings with an attention that caught him slightly off guard. He was accustomed to talent. He had worked alongside very talented people for his entire career, had hired a number of them, had occasionally lost them to competitors who outbid him, and had occasionally wondered afterward whether he had done enough to hold on to them. But there was something specifically striking about seeing ability like this trained, this precise, this deeply in command of itself, operating 6 years outside of any context built to recognize or use it. It reminded him of something he couldn't immediately name, and then one evening it came to him. It reminded him of the early years of his own company, when he had been the person in the room who understood something no one else quite understood yet and had no infrastructure around him to prove it. One night, working through a cluster of transactions from the previous year, Naomi stopped. She was quiet long enough that Daniel looked up from the Hale report he was reviewing. "There's a transfer here," she said. "It's different from the others." He came around to her side of the desk. She had found a transaction that didn't fit the rhythm of the rest of the network. Not in size, not in timing, but in destination. The others all fed ultimately toward the control account structure. This one went somewhere else entirely. A different layered subsidiary chain, constructed differently in different jurisdictions. It was smaller, but it was recent, 6 weeks ago. "This isn't the same network," she said. Someone built a second route. Daniel felt the cold, clarifying feeling again. Victor wasn't just moving money. He was building an exit. The second route was cleaner, newer, less used. It was the kind of thing you constructed when you were getting ready to use it seriously. He called Hale the next morning. Hale confirmed it by the afternoon. Victor was preparing for something. The second network was structured to move a much larger sum than anything that had gone through the first one. The account architecture could support a transfer well into the hundreds of millions if the source funds were there. And at Whitmore Systems, there was a situation unfolding that Daniel was only beginning to understand the full shape of. Victor had been meeting with board members individually. Daniel had pieced this together from small things, a passing comment from someone in the legal department, a slight stiffness in a board member's voice on a routine call that hadn't been there the week before, the particular quality of Victor's ease in the weekly leadership meeting that had the unmistakable texture of someone who had already had the harder conversations elsewhere and knew how they had gone. The narrative Victor had been quietly constructing was approaching some kind of conclusion. Daniel could feel the timing of it pressing in a way he recognized from his years in business. The particular compression of events that happens when someone else is steering toward a moment they have chosen, and you can see the shape of it coming before you could see the full detail. Whatever Victor intended to do with the second financial network, whatever large transfer he was preparing, it was coupled to something he was maneuvering within the board. The two tracks were running parallel, and they were going to arrive at the same point at approximately the same time. That was not coincidence. It was design. Detective Hale came to the mansion on a Thursday evening with a folder of printed documents and the expression Daniel associated with him, having found something that changed the scope of the investigation rather than just advancing it. He laid the papers on the study table without preamble. Naomi was there, and Hale had by this point moved past whatever adjustment he had made when he first realized she was a central part of the operation. He had watched her work for 2 sessions now and had arrived, with the quiet pragmatism of a former investigator, at an accurate assessment of what she brought to this. What Hale had found was a pattern of construction. The shell company network Victor had used wasn't unique to him. Hale had found structural matches in 3 other corporate fraud cases over the past decade. Different companies, different industries, different executives at the center of each one. But the method was identical in ways that went beyond coincidence or similar thinking. The same jurisdictional sequences, the same approach to account naming conventions, the same timing architecture between the layers. Someone had built the same machine multiple times for multiple clients and had been careful enough about it that none of the earlier cases had ever been publicly connected to each other. Victor didn't design this infrastructure himself, Hale said. He was not a man who made statements like that casually. He contracted it. He's working with people who run this as a service. They help corporate insiders construct the framework, execute the transfers, and handle the exit. This isn't amateur work. This is an organized operation that has done this before and gotten away with it. Naomi had been reading through the documents while Hale talked. She set one of them down and said, without looking up, "If that's true, then the second network has a schedule that Victor doesn't fully control. The people he's working with will have a timeline. The major transfer won't happen when Victor decides he's personally ready. It'll happen when they tell him the window is open. He'll move when they say move. Hale looked at her across the table. Then he looked at Daniel. She's right, he said. These operations run on their own timetable. The client follows instructions. Daniel nodded. He had been arriving at the same conclusion from a different angle, but hearing it confirmed by Hale gave it a different weight. If Victor was on someone else's schedule, they couldn't predict the timing from Victor's behavior alone. They needed to find the window from the other end. Then Hale told them the last thing he had found, which was the thing that changed the atmosphere in the room entirely. Victor hadn't just been running a financial operation out of Whitmore systems. He had also been watching it. Security monitoring equipment, sophisticated, not standard consumer gear, had been installed in 2 locations connected to the mansion. One was a relay near the estate's main server access point. The other was something Hale's contact had found evidence of inside the building itself, though the exact placement was still being determined. The 3 of them were silent for a moment. Naomi was the one who moved first. She turned slightly in her chair and looked at the corner of the study where the 2 cameras Daniel used for internal security sat on their standard mounts, one covering the door, one covering the desk area. She watched them for a moment without making it obvious she was watching them. Then she turned back to Daniel and said quietly, in a voice that was completely steady, "One of the cameras just moved." Daniel looked at the desk-facing camera. It was pointed differently than it had been an hour ago. Not by much, by just enough. He kept his face neutral. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the posture of a man finishing a routine evening's work, and said nothing. Naomi took her cue from him and closed her notebook. Hale stacked his papers with the unhurried movements of someone wrapping up a meeting. But before they stood up, before anyone made any motion toward leaving, Naomi leaned forward and said 3 words in a voice barely above a whisper. "Someone knows we're looking." The words had barely settled in the air when Daniel's phone, face up on the corner of the desk, lit up. A message from Victor Langford. Short, formal, and timed in a way that made the hair on Daniel's arms rise. Emergency board meeting requested. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Attendance critical. Daniel read it twice. He set the phone back down on the desk face up, the same way it had been before. He looked at Naomi. He looked at Hale. The camera in the corner of the study was still aimed at the desk. Victor's message was still glowing on Daniel's phone screen. Whatever was coming next was already in motion, and the man who had sat across from Daniel at board tables for 9 years had just made the first move in the open. Daniel looked at Hale, then at Naomi, and kept his voice completely level. "We don't change anything tonight," he said. "We go on as if nothing has shifted." He turned the phone face down on the desk with the unhurried movements of someone checking a routine message and setting it aside. Tomorrow morning would come soon enough, and with it the next phase of whatever Victor had spent the last 2 years building toward. Tonight, the most important thing they could do was give him no reason to speed up. The morning came gray and cold, the kind of March weather that made the oak trees along the driveway look stripped down to their essentials. Daniel left the mansion at 8:15 in a dark suit, alone, without telling anyone in the household where he was going or why. The drive to Whitmore Systems headquarters took 22 minutes, and he spent most of it thinking not about what he was going to say, but about what he was going to let Victor believe. The lobby of Whitmore Systems was all clean lines and polished concrete, the kind of design that signaled competence and permanence without trying too hard. Daniel had always liked it. This morning it felt different, like walking into something that had been quietly rearranged while he wasn't watching, the furniture in the same places, but the weight of the room shifted in some way that wasn't visible and was entirely real. The boardroom was on the 14th floor. When he stepped off the elevator, 3 of the board members were already in the hallway outside, speaking in low voices that stopped when they saw him. They greeted him with the careful politeness of people who have recently been told something about you and have not yet decided how much of it they believe. Daniel shook hands, asked about families, said nothing of substance, and went inside. Victor was already at the head of the table. That was the first move, the spatial claim, the early arrival, the establishment of whose meeting this was before Daniel even sat down. Victor had learned conference room dynamics a long time ago and applied them with the ease of long habit. He stood when Daniel entered, smiled, and said it was good of him to come on short notice. His voice had exactly the right note of warmth in it, the warmth of a man who was sorry about what was about to happen. "Victor," Daniel said and sat down. The remaining board members filed in over the next 10 minutes. 7 of them total, plus the company's general counsel, who had brought a junior associate Daniel had never seen before. The presence of legal staff in a configuration like this was its own kind of signal. Daniel logged it and showed nothing. Victor opened the meeting with a prepared presentation. It was good work. Daniel had to give him that even as he watched it being used against him. Clean slides, clear figures, a narrative that built logically and confidently from premise to conclusion. The premise was that Whitmore Systems had suffered significant financial deterioration over the past 2 quarters under current leadership. The evidence was a selective but technically accurate reading of the company's financials. Every loss highlighted, every gain contextualized in a way that made the gains look temporary and the losses look like symptoms of something deeper. The conclusion was that the company needed, in Victor's careful phrasing, a period of stable, focused stewardship while an independent financial review was conducted and confidence in the company's direction could be restored. He never said Daniel's name disparagingly. He never used words like incompetent or reckless, nothing that could be quoted back at him later as a direct attack on the man, rather than a concerned assessment of the situation. He didn't need to. The numbers he had chosen and the story he had built around them did all of that work invisibly, and he had clearly spent considerable time rehearsing the precise tone in which he delivered it. Concerned, reluctant, the careful posture of a long-tenured executive doing a genuinely difficult thing because the company's well-being left him no choice. It was, Daniel thought from across the table, an impressive performance, and it was going to work. 2 board members asked questions. Their questions were the kind that advanced Victor's argument rather than tested it. The questions of people who had been privately briefed before this meeting and were now providing the structure for the conclusion to land cleanly. Daniel watched this and felt the cold, clarifying anger move through him again and kept his face entirely still. A 3rd board member, Gerald Ashworth, who had been on the board for 12 years and was one of the 2 Daniel had always considered genuinely independent, asked a harder question about the specific transactions Victor was attributing to strategic failure. Victor answered smoothly. Ashworth didn't look entirely satisfied, but didn't push further. Daniel noted it and filed it away. The vote of no confidence was proposed at 9:47. A temporary suspension of the CEO role pending financial review, with Victor Langford stepping in as acting executive during the transition. The motion was seconded within 8 seconds. The room had a slightly held quality to it, the way rooms feel when an outcome has already been agreed upon and the formalities are being conducted for the record. Daniel looked around the table slowly. He counted the faces. 4 of the 7 board members had the particular settled stillness of people who had committed to a position before entering the room and were simply waiting for it to be completed. Gerald Ashworth and 1 other member, Patricia Webb, were watching Daniel with the careful attention of people who genuinely hadn't made up their minds and were waiting to see what he did before they did. The 7th member, a newer appointment named James Colton, was watching Victor with an expression that could have been admiration or unease, possibly both. Victor was looking at Daniel with the composed patience of a man who had calculated the outcome and was simply waiting for it to arrive. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. He took a measured breath. Then he said that he appreciated the board's concern, and that he took the financial situation of the company with the full seriousness it deserved, and that he thought a period of careful review was not an unreasonable idea. He said he was prepared to step aside from day-to-day operations temporarily, in the interest of the company and the people who depended on it, while a thorough and independent review was completed. Several faces around the table shifted toward surprise. Victor's composure held, but something behind his eyes moved. A small, satisfied adjustment, the internal confirmation that his read of the situation had been correct. The motion passed 5-2. Daniel thanked the board, shook hands with several members, and left the building the same way he had come in, calmly, without rushing, giving Victor no visible signal that anything about this was anything other than what it appeared to be. In the car on the way back to the mansion, he called Hale and said 3 words. He took the seat. Hale understood immediately. "How long do we have?" "Less than we thought," Daniel said. "Move faster." Back at the mansion, Naomi had been in the study since before Daniel left. She hadn't slept well. She rarely did when something was pressing, and she had come downstairs before dawn with her notebook and the secure drive Daniel had given her access to, and had kept working through the transaction records from the point where she had stopped the night before. What she found that morning stopped her in a way that few things did anymore. The fraudulent transfers she had been tracking were changing. Not in size, not yet, but in frequency. The rhythm she had mapped so carefully over the previous 2 weeks, the calibrated spacing she had identified as deliberately designed to stay beneath automated detection thresholds, had compressed over the past 7 days. The intervals were shorter. The gaps that had previously existed to avoid triggering review flags were narrowing in a way that was consistent with only one explanation. The operation was accelerating toward a conclusion. She ran the numbers 3 times. The pattern held each time. She pulled out a separate sheet from the back of her notebook and began working through what a full escalation of the network would look like. The maximum possible transfer if Victor moved every available fund through the architecture she had mapped, all channels activating simultaneously rather than in the staggered rotation he had been using. She worked carefully, checking each figure twice before moving to the next, and arrived at the same answer both times she completed the calculation. $200 million. She sat with that number for a moment in the quiet of the early morning study, the rest of the house still asleep around her. Then she turned to the second network, the newer, more tightly constructed one that Hale had identified and she had been analyzing separately for the past several days. She had been working through its architecture methodically, tracing the account structure from the outside in, looking for the transaction signature that would tell her when the network was designed to activate. The answer was embedded in the routing timing of the outermost layer. The second network was not built for the slow, distributed approach of the first one. It was built for a single decisive movement. One large transfer, structured to pass through verification windows so quickly that a standard monitoring system would flag it as irregular approximately 4 to 6 minutes after it was already gone. The people who had built this network understood the monitoring infrastructure and had designed around its response time. She traced the compliance window. She cross-referenced the verification gateway timing against the account activation sequence. The numbers converged on a specific point. The transfer window was midnight, 48 hours from now. She circled it twice and wrote the time beside it. She was still sitting with the notebook open in front of her and the 200 million figure circled twice when she heard Daniel's car in the driveway. He came in through the side entrance and walked directly to the study. She turned when he came through the door, and she could read his face well enough by now to know how the morning had gone. "He got the seat," she said. "Yes." He sat down across from her. "Then we have less time than we thought." She turned the notebook to show him what she had found. She watched him read the circled number. She watched his jaw tighten in the way it did when he was absorbing something he had already partly prepared himself for, and it was still worse than he had prepared for. 48 hours, he said. "Less now. The window opens at midnight the night after tomorrow." He called Hale immediately. Hale picked up on the first ring, which meant he had been expecting the call. Daniel gave him the timeline. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Hale said he had something too. He had confirmed earlier that morning that the organized network Victor was working with had moved 2 principals out of the country in the past 72 hours. They were clearing the way. When the transfer happened, Victor was meant to follow. "He's planning to disappear," Hale said. The board move wasn't about controlling the company. It was about getting access to the accounts long enough to authorize the transfer. Acting CEO means his authorization codes go through without secondary approval. Daniel looked at Naomi. She had heard. She was already writing. "Naomi," Daniel said quietly, "may be the only person who can actually stop the transfer before it clears." She didn't look up from the notebook. "I know," she said. That evening the mansion was quieter than usual. Mrs. Aldrich had sensed, with the particular perception of someone who had managed a household through more than one crisis, that something was happening that she wasn't being told about, and had managed the rest of the staff with an efficiency that cleared the East Wing by 8 o'clock. She didn't ask questions. She never had. It was part of what made her exceptional at her work. By 9 o'clock, Naomi had the full architecture of the transfer system spread across the desk in a combination of handwritten diagrams and printed routing maps that Hale had dropped off earlier in the evening. She was working through the encrypted transaction routing layer by layer, not hacking in a way that required breaking codes, but following the financial logic the way she would follow any complex transaction chain, finding the points where the routing had to surface from the encryption to interact with real account infrastructure. Those surface points were the vulnerability. Every transaction, no matter how well constructed the shell around it, had to interface with the actual banking system at some point. And at the interface points, there were rules, compliance windows, verification requirements, timing constraints that existed because the financial system required them, not because Victor's network had designed them in. Those constraints were where she could work. Daniel was at the side table with Hale's latest files when Naomi's phone buzzed on the corner of the desk. She picked it up, read it, set it back down without a change in her expression, but the way she set it down, carefully, with a deliberateness that wasn't her usual movement, made Daniel look up. "What is it?" She turned the phone to show him. The message was from a number she didn't recognize. It said, "Stop looking into things that don't concern you." The room was quiet for a moment. Daniel read it twice. How long ago was this sent? Just now. He picked up his own phone and called Hale. He read the message to him. Hale was silent for a few seconds and then said he'd run the number, but not to expect much. These messages came from disposables. More important was the fact that it had been sent at all. Someone in Victor's network was aware enough of what Naomi was doing to want her to stop. That meant one of two things. Either the surveillance through the mansion cameras had given them more than just a visual, or there was a second layer of monitoring they hadn't found yet. "Keep working," Hale said. "Don't change anything. If you stop, they'll know you got the message and it scared you. If you keep going, we maintain the uncertainty." Naomi had already turned back to the routing maps. She kept working. The night passed slowly. Daniel stayed. He wasn't going to leave her alone in the study with a thread on her phone and a surveillance camera that had already shown itself to be compromised, and she didn't ask him to. They worked in the focused, mostly quiet way they had developed over the past week. She on the financial architecture, he on the strategic picture with Hale's documentation. The two threads running parallel and occasionally intersecting when something she found matched something he was reading. Around 1 in the morning, she found the central routing account. She had been working toward it for 3 days, approaching it from the transaction signature side, looking for the mathematical heartbeat of the network, the account whose timing pattern controlled the behavior of all the others. She had found it in the first network weeks ago. The second network was more tightly encrypted, but the underlying logic was the same because the same people had built it, and people repeat their methods, even when they're trying to be careful. She circled it on the diagram. She wrote the account identifier beside it. She looked at it for a moment. "If someone can get into this account before midnight tomorrow," she said, "and freeze the outbound transfer authorization, the whole thing stops." Daniel looked at it. "Can you do that?" She was quiet for a moment. Not the hesitation of someone who didn't know, the quiet of someone thinking through exactly how. "I need 1 more day of access to the routing system and a clean connection," she said. "If Hale can get me the compliance interface credential for the primary verification gateway, I can redirect the monitoring signal and flag the transfer before it authorizes. It won't reverse what Victor has already moved, but it stops the 200 million. Daniel looked at her steadily. "I'll get them." The next morning, Naomi took the bus to the hospital. She hadn't been in 4 days, the longest stretch since Eli's treatment had entered the critical phase, and she needed to go, both for him and for herself. She needed to see him before tomorrow night. She needed to have that in her before whatever the next 24 hours brought. The neurological ward was the same as it always was. The same careful quiet, the same lowered lights, the same particular smell of the place that she had stopped noticing months ago and now could only detect when she had been away from it long enough that her senses reset. She walked down the corridor to Eli's room and knocked lightly before pushing the door open. He was awake. That was a better morning than the last time she had come. He was 17 and looked younger in the hospital bed than he did in her memory of him before any of this. Smaller somehow, though he had actually grown 2 inches since the diagnosis, which the doctor said was a sign the disease hadn't affected his physical development the way some cases did. He had their mother's eyes and their father's stubbornness and a specific kind of dry humor that he deployed at the least expected moments, and that Naomi had come to depend on in ways she never admitted to him. "You look tired," he said by way of hello. "I am tired. Are you still doing the thing?" She sat down in the chair beside the bed. "What thing?" "The thing you're doing. I can always tell when you're doing a thing." He looked at her with the particular attention of someone who has had a lot of time to study the people who come into his room. "It's the thing." She looked at him. "I'm finishing something," she said. "After tomorrow it should be done." He was quiet for a moment. "The money," he said. Not asking. "Part of it," she said. "A bigger part." He nodded once in the way he had, slow, accepting, the nod of someone who had learned that certain things were true and that asking more questions about them didn't change what was true. She stayed for an hour. She helped him with the crossword from the nurse's station newspaper, which he was 2/3 through and stuck on a 7-letter word for persistence that she supplied without pausing. He told her she'd missed her calling. She said she hadn't missed it. She'd had it interrupted, and there was a difference. He thought about that for a moment and then said that was probably the most Naomi thing she had ever said to him, which was high competition. She smiled in the way she only smiled in this room. Before she left, she stood at the window of his room and looked out at the courtyard below, a small paved square with a bench and a tree just beginning to show the first faint signs of coming back. She was thinking about what the next 24 hours would require, turning it over not with fear, but with the careful attention of someone who needed to understand the full shape of a thing before she could move cleanly through it. Eli said from behind her, "You're going to be okay." She turned to look at him. "You always get that look before something works out," he said. "You've had it your whole life. Mom used to call it your problem-solving face. Said it meant whatever you were working on was already half done." She looked at him for a moment. He was 17 years old and had been in a hospital for the better part of 18 months, and he was trying to reassure her. She walked back to the bed and kissed the top of his head, which he tolerated with the specific, dignified resignation of a teenage boy who knew better than to object. "Get some sleep," she said. "You too," he said. "You need it more than I do." She took the bus back to the mansion through the gray afternoon, and for the first time in several days, she felt something that was close to settled. Not certain. She was never certain until she had finished a thing, but settled enough to move forward clearly. That evening, after dark fell and the household quieted, Naomi sat back down at the study desk and worked for 3 hours straight. She was mapping the specific interface points in the routing system where she could intercept the transfer authorization signal without triggering an alert in Victor's network prematurely. It was careful work requiring her to hold multiple moving pieces in mind simultaneously. She was accustomed to that kind of thinking, had been doing it her whole adult life with different variables. Daniel sat at the side table and read through Hale's files and occasionally looked up at her, because there was nothing useful to say and she didn't need commentary. She needed quiet and time. He understood that and provided it. When she got back, Daniel was waiting in the study with a look that had 2 pieces to it. One he let her see immediately, and one he was holding back. He gave her the compliance interface credentials Hale had retrieved through a contact at the Financial Oversight Authority. Legitimate access, properly obtained, the kind that would hold up to scrutiny afterward. He told her Hale had confirmed the transfer window, midnight tomorrow, exactly as she had calculated. Then he told her the second piece. Someone had been at the hospital asking about Eli. Not a doctor, not a nurse, not anyone on the care team. A man who had come to the floor reception and asked general questions about patients under neurological care, specifically about young patients with family visiting regularly. The floor nurse who had mentioned it to Hale's contact hadn't thought much of it at the time, but Hale had thought something of it immediately. Naomi stood still when she heard this. She was quiet for long enough that Daniel said her name. "I know," she said. "I know what it means. Hale is going to have someone at the hospital tonight and tomorrow," Daniel said. Discreet. Eli won't know anyone is there. Nothing is going to happen to him. She looked at the window. The afternoon light was thin and flat against the glass. She was doing the calculation she always did when something new came into the equation, measuring what it cost against what it changed and what it didn't change. It means Victor knows about Eli, she said. Yes. He's trying to scare me into stopping. Yes. She turned back to the desk. She sat down, opened her notebook to the page with the central account circled, and picked up her pencil. He picked the wrong thing to use, she said. Eli is the reason I don't stop. Daniel watched her settle back into the work with the focused patience he had come to recognize as her particular kind of courage. Not loud, not dramatic, not performed for anyone in the room. Just the quiet determination of a person who had survived everything life had already sent at her and understood, from experience, that survival was not a matter of circumstances. It was a decision you made and kept making 1 hour at a time until the thing you were surviving was behind you. He didn't say anything. He sat back down at the side table, opened Hale's files, and kept working beside her. Tomorrow night at midnight. It would either be over or it wouldn't. Until then, there was still more to do. The night of the transfer came in cold and still. By 10 o'clock, the mansion was dark, except for the amber light leaking under the study door, and by 11, Naomi had stopped speaking except when something in the routing system required her to read a sequence aloud to confirm it. Daniel sat nearby and confirmed each one. Hale was on the phone in intervals, calling in from a position 2 blocks from Victor's, building with updates on the lights in Victor's office window. The lights were still on. Naomi had the full architecture mapped across the desk, handwritten diagrams on one side, printed routing maps on the other, her notebook open to the page with the central account circled, and the midnight timestamp written beside it in ink she had gone over twice. The compliance interface credentials Hale had obtained were loaded on the secure laptop. The verification gateway was open. She had one shot at this. Once she began redirecting the monitoring signal, the network would register the interference within a few minutes. She needed to be fast enough that the freeze on the outbound authorization landed before Victor's side could respond and reroute. At 11:42, she said, "I'm going to start." Daniel looked at her. "Are you ready?" She was already typing. The first layer went smoothly. The outer routing signal redirected without triggering a flag, exactly as she had calculated. She moved to the second layer, working through the verification gateway with the credentials and a sequence she had constructed over the previous 2 days by mapping the compliance window, timing down to its narrowest interval. The second layer was tighter. It pushed back twice, requiring her to adjust the approach signal and re-enter through a slightly different pathway. She did it without pausing, without second-guessing, her hands moving steadily across the keyboard in the quiet of the study. At 11:51, Hale called. "Victor's office lights just went dark," he said. "Car left the building 30 seconds ago. He's moving." Daniel crossed to the window without turning on any additional lights. "How long to the mansion?" 20 minutes in this traffic. Maybe 15 if he runs it. Naomi did not look up from the screen. At 11:56, she reached the central account. The transfer authorization was sitting in the queue, $212 million, structured to release at midnight through 3 simultaneous routing paths. She could see the architecture of it clearly now that she was inside the verification layer. It was well constructed. Whoever had designed the network had been thorough, but they had built it for speed and concealment, not for the possibility that someone would be standing inside the compliance gateway, redirecting the monitoring signal from the inside. That was a specific gap in their planning, and it was the gap she had been working toward for 2 weeks. She began the freeze sequence. The account's outbound authorization required a compliance flag to clear the final gateway. She inserted a hold flag into the verification queue, legitimate, properly formatted, the kind that a compliance monitoring system would generate automatically if it caught an irregularity. To the network, it would look like an automated hold. To the transfer, it would look like a wall. At 11:59, she finished typing. She pressed the final confirmation. The outbound authorization queue cleared. The transfer did not move. The hold flag was in place. She sat back in the chair and let out one long, slow breath. Daniel was watching her from across the room. She looked at the screen for another moment to make sure the flag was holding, then looked at the timestamp in the corner of the monitor. Midnight exactly. Then they heard the front door. Victor did not knock. He came through the main entrance with the key that still worked because no one had thought to change the locks before tonight, and his footsteps in the hallway had the particular quality of someone who was moving fast and was angry enough that they had stopped being careful about what they sounded like. Daniel stepped to the center of the study. Naomi closed the laptop. The study door opened. Victor stood in the doorway in his overcoat, his composure fractured in a way that Daniel had never seen in 9 years of sitting across tables from this man. His face was tight, his jaw set, his eyes moving between Daniel and Naomi and the desk, and the closed laptop with a rapid assessment of someone trying to calculate how bad the damage was in real time. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. He was looking at Naomi. She looked back at him and said nothing. "That transfer was the culmination of 2 years of work," he said. His voice was controlled, but just barely, the control of a man gripping something slippery. 2 years of managing this company's finances, covering for decisions that would have collapsed this operation without me. I built something that worked. All I needed was one transaction, and I was gone. No one got hurt. The company survives. You." He looked at Naomi with an expression that was part fury and part something that looked almost like disbelief. "You are a maid. You clean floors. You had no business in any of this." "She had more business in it than you did," Daniel said. "She found it." Whitmore Systems stock dropped sharply in the first 2 hours, and then steadied as the full picture emerged and investors understood that the fraud had been detected and stopped rather than allowed to run to completion. By the end of the trading day, it had recovered most of the loss. The $200 million transfer had not gone through. The $40 million moved through earlier transfers was being traced through asset recovery proceedings. The board called an emergency session on Friday morning. Gerald Ashworth opened it by saying the board had been manipulated and that correcting that was the first order of business. Patricia Webb seconded him. The remaining members, several of whom had spent Thursday evening coming to terms with the fact that Victor had briefed them with curated fiction, were ready to move quickly. The motion to reinstate Daniel Whitmore as CEO passed unanimously. James Colton was the first to second it. Daniel thanked the board and said there was work to do. The public acknowledgement happened the following week. In a statement Daniel released alongside the company's official response to the fraud investigation. Most of it was standard corporate language. The company cooperated fully. Steps would be taken. The integrity of the organization had been upheld. The last paragraph was not standard language. It described the role of a member of the household staff who had identified financial irregularities through her own initiative, whose analytical work had been central to tracing the fraud network, and without whose contribution the $200 million transfer would not have been intercepted. It named her. Naomi Carter read it on her phone, sitting in the hospital waiting area on the 4th floor, where she had come to be with Eli when he heard that his treatment had been approved and fully funded. She read it twice. Then she put the phone in her pocket and went into his room to tell him the news. He was awake. She sat down in the chair beside the bed and told him about the treatment, the timeline, the doctors, the plan. She told him everything was arranged. She watched him take it in, watched his face move through the various stages of a 17-year-old receiving information that had been the center of his sister's entire life for 18 months, and then watched him look at her with her mother's eyes and say, in a voice that was working hard to stay even, "You did it." "We did it," she said. He shook his head slightly. "You did it." She let him have that. She looked out the window at the courtyard below, at the tree that had now come far enough back that you could see the green beginning in the branches, and she felt the particular quality of relief that only arrives after something has been pressing on you for long enough that you had almost stopped noticing the weight of it. It doesn't arrive. The conversation that followed, the real one, happened in the hospital corridor while Eli slept. Daniel told Naomi there was a position at Whitmore Systems in the financial analytics division. Not an entry-level position, not a courtesy appointment, but a role that matched what she had demonstrated she could do. He told her the salary. He told her the scope of the work. He told her the decision was entirely hers, and that he had already spoken to the division head, who had looked at the transaction analysis she had produced and said, with some feeling, that he wanted to understand how she had gotten there. Naomi stood with her hands in her jacket pockets and looked at the linoleum floor for a moment. Then she looked up. "I need to finish out the week with Mrs. Aldridge," she said. "She deserves proper notice." Daniel almost smiled. "Of course. And I want to start after Eli's first treatment cycle. I need to be here for the first 2 weeks. That's not a problem." She nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone who has finished calculating and found the answer acceptable. "Then yes," she said. 3 weeks later, Naomi stood outside the hospital on the morning Eli was cleared to move to outpatient treatment. The March cold had finally broken. The sky was pale and wide, and the kind of clear that felt like the weather had finally committed to something. She stood on the sidewalk with her coat open and let the thin warmth of it land on her face for a moment. She thought about the night in the study when she had counted her money under the amber lamp and whispered to herself and believed, as completely as she had ever believed anything, that she was alone. She thought about what had come from that night. The conversation, the investigation, the midnight transfer of Victor in the doorway, and now this morning, her brother walking out of hospital on his own feet. She thought about all the things you set in motion without knowing anyone is watching. Eli came through the automatic doors carrying the small bag she had packed for him, wearing his regular clothes for the first time in weeks, and he blinked in the sunlight like someone remembering what it was. "Ready," she said. "Been ready," he said. They walked to the bus stop together in the thin, clear March warmth, unhurried, no place urgent to be. That same afternoon, Daniel was in the study. The routing maps were gone. The desk was clean. The amber lamp was on in the early afternoon. Light, the way it was always on when he worked in here, had been on for years before any of this. He was reading a report from the Financial Analytics Division about the first round of internal audit improvements following the fraud case. And it was a good report, specific, precise, rigorous in the way that only happened when someone who understood what they were looking at had written it. He set it down and looked at the desk, at the room where he had stood in the dark of the doorway, and watched a woman count her own money under this lamp and whisper a name to herself in the silence. At the chair where she had sat across from him and answered every question he put to her without hesitation. At the lamp itself, still amber, still giving the same light. He thought about what he had been before all of this, how insulated, how sealed off in the specific loneliness of a life where everyone around you has something to gain from your approval. He had been surrounded by people for 20 years and had slowly become unreachable by any of them. It took a woman with a spiral notebook and a sick brother and more ability than any role she'd been given a hold to remind him that people were worth paying attention to. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the oak trees and the cracked stone path and the long driveway in the thin afternoon light. Then he walked back to the desk and went back to work. How many brilliant people are we walking past every single day without ever truly seeing them? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. There are more stories here that will stay with you long after they end.